Google.
Self-described mild-mannered journalist, he's covered topics such as Satanism, helping children, Watergate, and most importantly, exposing pedophile networks. The most knowledgeable, innocent man on Epstein, and recently exposing more about Diddy parties, truly Nick Bryant has become public enemy number one of some of the worst people in our society. He's been featured on esteemed shows such as Matt and Shane's Secret Podcast, The Dillon Show, Warmode, and The Shawn Ryan Show, and many others. Nick Bryant, he smartly keeps his private life private, so sources are limited, but has ties to Minneapolis, spending much of his youth there, and lives in New York. As a young man, he was spiritually searching, and he spent time in the shram of an Indian guru, His Holiness Sri Swami Rama, where he left after finding out the guru didn't live up to his code of conduct, and using vices he claimed he didn't, smoking, women, etc., which is funny, and Nick has some humorous stories about.
In my teens, I was really searching, and I tried all kinds of spiritual paths. And then I ended up living on this ashram with a genuine Indian guru. He was a Swami, which means he was celibate. And so I got there, and I was thirsty for knowledge. And then I was talking to the Swami one day, and I could have swore I smelled cigarettes on his breath. And, I went to one of the people on the ashram, who I would later call the pod people. I said, I could have sworn I smelled cigarettes on Swami's breath. And he goes, yeah, well, see, the deal with that is he has to have one vice that keeps him tethered to this plane of reality so he can teach us. And now, needless to say, that didn't make a lot of sense to me. And then I found out that he was having sex with all these girls on the ashram. And then I found out he was embezzling money from his more affluent initiates. And I was thinking to myself, that guy must be really spiritually developed.
Nick has always had an interest in writing about America's youth, especially the underprivileged, co-authoring a book, America's Children, Triumph or Tragedy, where he discusses topics in depth. Early in Nick's writing career, he gained experience writing dark stories with disturbing themes. He met with an editor of Rolling Stone who asked him to pitch some dark stories. Nick replied, Nazis or Satanists. The editor quickly jumped on the idea of Satanism.
So what you were just saying is how you got involved in the Franklin scandal at the very beginning. So let's jump right in.
I was talking to an editor at Rolling Stone, and he said, pitch me dark stories. And, I said, just kind of throwing my hands up in there. So, what do you want? Do you want a story on Nazis? Do you want a story on Satanists? What do you want? And he goes, Satanists. That sounds good.
While becoming acquainted with Satanism, he quickly realized they were more of a pathetic and underwhelming group than he originally expected. He found them a rather unsavory lot, end quote. He says they were kind of immoral and some were just edgy. Nick described in his book that he had a simple plan: ferret out the Satanists, attend a black mass, write the article. Over the next month or so, he talked to a gamut of Satanists, and he determined that with these Satanists, they were either above average intelligence or borderline cognitively challenged, and not a lot in between. He quickly became acquainted with a man, Anthony, he describes as the first of the cerebral Satanists he met. He was fond of black blazer, black shirt, black pants, even black socks and shoes. Nick and Anthony connected over their love of philosophy. Nick said that Anthony would allow him to come to a black mass, a dark reverse of the Catholic mass, but Nick had to partake of the host, which is where the high priest and priestess put their respective semen and menstrual fluid on a cracker. Nick said he quickly ghosted Anthony.
You have to eat wasn't the part?
Eat like a cum cookie?
He was trying to get you to eat
yes.
cum.
Well, that was one of the problems.
Was your editor come on?
The host was the potentiated ministration and semen of the high priestess and then the priest.
On what? What was the
on a floury wafer? With the Satanists, everything is anti, it's an anti-host.
Sure.
Yeah. So and it's an anti-black mass, whatever.
While researching Satanism on the web, Nick came across a lot of talk about a group called the Finders, an alleged satanic abuse cult with ties to Washington, D.C. Well, I will eventually do a whole video on the Finders. I'm going to give the brief synopsis here. So the Finders came to mainstream knowledge in Tallahassee, Arizona, when a van with 2 men in suits and 6 dirty, almost feral children went to a park. A concerned citizen called the police, and the men were charged with child abuse. The kids had signs of sexual abuse, and the men were linked to a group called the Finders, who, while have a worldwide network, they're tied to DC. They have a warehouse there. And this cult has been shrouded in some mystery. I'll speak to what's known, like actually known to the facts. So what's known is there was child porn found in the warehouse and strange pictures of things like children killing animals and jars of piss and shit. U.S. Customs got involved due to the child pornography, and in a declassified report by the Customs, the investigation got turned over to the State Department because it was, quote, a CIA internal matter, end quote. And seemingly the investigation ended, charges were dropped, and since the finders have been chalked up to satanic panic, and no one thinks about them but the fringe weirdos online like me.
And then I came across a cult called the Finders that had been busted by the U.S. Customs for trafficking children. They had 6 kids in Tallahassee, Arizona, and some concerned citizens called Tallahassee Police Department, and the Tallahassee Police Department arrested the 2 finders and put the 6 kids in protective custody.
Yeah.
And the 2 finders were arraigned on multiple counts of child abuse, multiple counts, and they were held at a $100,000 bond. I think it was the U.S. Customs report. U.S. Customs got involved with it because there was child pornography. And they got a search warrant for the warehouse where the finders lived, and they found child pornography.
And the warehouse is in like D.C., right?
Yes, in Washington, D.C. And they found all kinds of really unsavory things. And all of a sudden, the CIA came in and quashed the entire case. And those 2 finders were just let out of jail, and those kids were repatriated with the cult. And I thought to myself, I kind of thought I knew how the world worked.
This broke the reality that Nick lived in, that in which those in political power would cover things like this up on both a small, local, and big federal level with multiple agencies. While researching about the finders and the idea of cover-ups, something that Nick was still pretty skeptical of, he kept hearing about the unremarkable town of Omaha, Nebraska over and over again. Little did he know this would take him down the deepest rabbit hole of his whole career. Online, Nick discovered a book from former state senator from Nebraska named John DeCamp, and a documentary that never really aired from the BBC, where it explained that a credit union in Omaha, Nebraska, ran by a prominent Republican donor, was the center of a pedo network spanning the whole country with a cover-up so obvious it was literally unbelievable to Nick. After crowdsourcing thoughts with friends he showed the book and the documentary, he determined, and they thought, he should go deeper on the subject. Without the support of an editor, he made the trip to Omaha. I could plan to, if there's enough interest, make a few-hour documentary on the Franklin scandal. So please let me know if there's interest. But in this video, I will break down more of a summary and then the personal story of kind of Nick going through it to the best I can recollect and find. While going through the summary of the scandal, I want to let you know up front that a grand jury investigation determined that child abuse allegations were a hoax, at least those involving our main subject. Now, I'm going to still tell it as if it happened. This is all alleged, and I'm going to do it this way because it's the narrative that Nick and the victims give us. To quote one of Nick's favorite quotes, though, from a New York judge, a grand jury could indict a ham sandwich. I'm not a lawyer. I don't exactly know how grand juries work, but the difference from my understanding is they have a special prosecutor. They're sealed so the information isn't public, and that prosecutor gets to determine 100% of what the jury sees. So it makes it more susceptible to corruption. Our story starts with Larry King. No, not the talk show host. This Larry King was an Omaha socialite, the Franklin Credit Union general manager, and an Epstein-like procurer and creator of a large pedophile and child pornography network. The Franklin Credit Union in Omaha was involved in a scandal in which $40 million went missing, a large amount of which was stolen by King, who started high-rolling with multiple cars, houses, and businesses. He and the credit union had suspiciously not been audited. While a state Senate committee investigated the financial crimes, they quickly became aware of several independent allegations of King and other high-profile individuals involving child sexual abuse and such. Allegedly, King would have large sex parties with adults and children where drugs were prominent. He had a photographer named Rusty Nelson who would take pictures of adults with children for blackmail as well as just children for porn. A lot of these children came from underprivileged environments. One great example is the Washington sisters, who were put into foster care under the care of King's cousin, I believe. Now, another group brought into this is the Boys Town Orphanage, an orphanage with a great reputation. Seemingly, young men from there were involved in many stories of being roped into this. As later came out, King was a homosexual and liked young boys. Not only did boys from the orphanage claim this, I believe the Washington sisters and then Alicia Owens, who I'll get to, also claimed that Boys Town boys were at these parties. Now, seemingly
these kids were from really dysfunctional backgrounds, poor backgrounds, and they were given money and repeatedly molested. And then once they lost their youthful marketability, they were expunged by the network. And they went on to become criminals to support. They were all drug addicts.
Yeah.
Or most of them were drug addicts. So they became criminals and then they ended up in prison.
Now, seemingly like Epstein, there was a recruitment process kid by kid. The kids would recruit, older kids would recruit the younger kids to make some money. Now, state, local, and federal police would undermine the Senate committee investigation. Their investigator, Garadori, and the victims, and they would do this through tapping phone line type stuff. They threats, passive threats, misreporting, taking evidence from the investigator, claiming that they were now going to do investigation, though it seems that they never did investigation. Just all sorts of things. And it was something that was quite disturbing to read. Many victims, with little knowledge of each other, did corroborate many instances, stories, accounts, places, settings. And these are some of the most horrific accounts of child abuse and weird rituals that I've read. One victim, last name of Moore, she claims that there were some satanic and even murders that she witnessed as being a part of King's network. Then they would later try to imprison victims of the sexual abuse, claiming that they perjured themselves during the grand jury, and they would convict Alicia Owens, who I believe faced the most injustice, as she then spent several years in prison for telling the truth, at least as she claims it. And she was a model prisoner after this. They can go through the records, and she did, in the end, though, I think she made it out okay. She had a family, became a productive member of society, and as you read it, she seems to be one of the few people who made it out okay.
FBI was, what the FBI did in Nebraska was very, very nefarious. Threatening perpetrators, threatening victims.
The investigator, Garadori, would eventually, in his process for the investigation, try and meet with Rusty Nelson in Chicago to get some blackmail pictures that he took of King and some of these others as definitive proof, so that way there couldn't be any issues, because the news was slandering them. And funny enough, one of the head honchos at the newspaper was accused of, some of these misdeeds, so to speak. And it's sadly, in an all too expected turn for this case, the plane the investigator was piloting mysteriously crashed on his way back from the meeting, killing him and his son before he could confirm or give the pictures to anyone, if he got the pictures. This is one of just many suspicious suicides linked with Franklin, as they never determined how or why he crashed the plane.
And they met in Chicago, and I've got 5 corroborations on this, that Rusty gave him pictures in Chicago. And Gary Caradori was flying back to Nebraska, and his plane blew up in midair. And then that was pretty much, and then the grand juries came out, shortly thereafter and said that there was no child abuse. And there's that Chinese proverb, kill one man, silence 1,000. Well, with this case, it was kill one man and his son and silence, 10,000.
Well, Nick goes into extreme detail with great evidence. I believe it was a 20-hour audible listen. I'm giving you a summary and just trying to show you how messed up this was. as well as doing it in a way that won't shadow ban me from details. 4 details. During the investigation of Franklin, again, this took place years after kind of the conclusion of the main investigation and scandal. Nick stayed with his friend Dirk, who someone he met at the before-mentioned shram of his youth. Though his trips to Omaha after these years, when the case was kind of quote-unquote closed, so to speak, the silence and intimidation was still very, very real. Nick describes
okay, so by the time this happened, I'd interviewed a victim. I'd interviewed Rusty Nelson. I caught someone following me. I was like, DEFCON 4 at this point. And and my buddy Dirk was, he was getting, kind of uptight about it too, because I'd obviously kicked the hornet's nest. And I don't know what exactly was going on in her head.
Right.
I do not know. But when she said you're in a great deal of danger and they're going to kill you,
there's that.
Yeah.
That kind of
You get the feeling when you're reading the book that there's like a slow roll of like a buildup of paranoia.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Nick describes his first trips to Omaha, and he describes meeting with the victims throughout the whole thing as them being terrified still. It took a lot of him building trust with people, and people still seem to, I don't want to say go missing, but just still weird things would happen to certain people involved once Nick got there. Now, Nick describes on the first trip being, and on others, but the first trip was the scariest, I think, of the stories, of him on his way to meet with the first victim being tailed by a brown sedan, and he describes them following him through dirt roads and him trying to lose them. And there's many other people who describe being followed in this case, but again, we're focusing on Nick, and he describes a very ominous woman or a very ominous incident of a woman harassing him and Dirk at Dirk's house.
I hear a knock on the door, and I go look through the home. It's this really freaky looking woman.
Ugh.
And she says, I've got a book for you. So this woman said, I want to give you a book. And at this point, I did not want my fingerprints on that book, and I didn't want her fingerprints in my friend's apartment.
Yeah.
So I said, please leave. And she wouldn't leave. And I said, come on, just leave, and then, and then
scary.
And then I got her, and then she eventually left. Dirk is making dinner, and then she comes back, and then Dirk looks at her. I look at her, through the people, and I said, "Dude, we can't let her in this apartment, and we don't want her fingerprints in this apartment at all. We don't want her fingerprint on that book." So
now, I think this story also exemplifies why Nick, if anything they tried to do to him, didn't happen, because it shows just how paranoid and precautious Nick was. And even though, again, Nick describes himself not as conspiratorial, I think Nick's just quick. So he describes at a time, many people became aware he was in town. When he would talk to someone, they'd be like, yeah, we know you're here. It's still, very, very scary. He describes death threats to not just him, but to those involved, but to him as well, and seemingly other creepy things kind of happening in the periphery. He describes the near palpable sense of fear and being watched, or that feeling of being watched every time he was there. And he describes one incident as in the introduction of the book where he is with the photographer Rusty Nelson, the before mentioned one, who promised Nick some evidence in the form of pictures he hid in the mountains of Colorado. And as they were coming back to Nebraska from Colorado, the state border patrol, or the border, it's not the state border, they were passing the state border, and the police stopped him for no real reason, and they kind of shook him and Rusty down. They seemed to obviously know who they were based on some of the things they said, and they were just kind of being real weird, kind of legally gray, and Nick believes they knew who he was, why he was there, and potentially what they had in the car. In a positive way, they didn't, and in a sad way, they didn't have any of the pictures, they didn't have any of the evidence. But Nick still describes that incident, and it still seems, even after all these years, their cover-up is still in progress. Franklin would be connected to Nick for the rest of his life, something he didn't know going into this. While he worked on Franklin for years between doing freelance writing jobs, he would find sources and connections that would become invaluable to him in his continued investigations into pedo networks and intelligence malfeasance.
I mean, the Franklin scandal, I was very, very cautious with it and very, very careful. I wanted to nail everything.
Since Franklin, Nick co-authored a book, Confessions of a DC Madam, which follows the account of a man who ran a DC escort service and a man named Craig Spence who ran blackmail parties and such, who has ties to King and seems kind of like an Epstein-like figure. And it follows the sexual misconduct of DC highly connected people. Take who you think that could be. And apparent blackmail that follows, and the cover-up by law enforcement and FBI. He worked on a book on Watergate, highlighting the inconsistencies and issues with the publicly accepted narrative. And it seems Nick was very early to talk about this Watergate thing, at least from what I can find. I've since seen it discussed on the Tucker Carlson podcast, but Watergate was seemingly a coup which resulted in the first unelected president in Ford, I believe. Now, this takes us to 2019, the biggest story of the year, which was covered up by Shane's cancellation. We hear a story which broke almost all images of the American justice system in a way that's never been done before. Jeffrey Epstein, unknown billionaire who is surrounded by mystery. One consistent thing we heard over and over again was the little black book. That black book was published by Nick, who has been following the Epstein story before it was a story. He started tracking Epstein around 2012.
It's gone to hell.
Well, there's a tremendous amount of evidence to suggest that Jeffrey Epstein has been pandering underage children to politically connected and powerful people. He was himself, Epstein was indicted for molesting a minor, and he got off very lightly. He should have been indicted for molesting multiple minors, but those molestations were covered up. But he got off very lightly. I think he spent 13 months in the county jail, and he was allowed to go out during the day. So Jeffrey Epstein was definitely given preferential treatment. And I've got his black book, and it's published on Gawker.com. And
since then, Nick has been tracking the Epstein case and been bringing things to the mainstream knowledge. Due to Nick's connections and looking into Franklin and Craig Spence and such, put Nick in a perfect place to make the right connections at the right time, get him access to Epstein's black book, and for him to publish it. Now, with information going on with Diddy, Nick has been able to quickly deduce Diddy as some kind of blackmail asset and has been talking quite frequently about Diddy. He made a second appearance on Shawn Ryan recently.
P. Diddy had freak-off parties, a bacchanalian orgy, essentially. And politicians went to those parties. Celebrities went to those parties. Sports stars went to those parties. He had an audiovisual blackmail thing going on, like Epstein, like Craig Spence, because P. Diddy dealt with some unbelievably powerful people. Can P. Diddy blackmail those people by themselves? Or is he blackmailing for some kind of covert entity? But the fact that we got Damian Williams overseeing his investigation, there were so many sexual assault lawsuits getting filed against him that something had to be done. And all this was coming out about his beating up women. And there was a president of Bad Boy Records that he took a baseball bat to. I mean, he's just a nasty piece of work. And I think it reached a critical mass where something had to be done. So call in Damian Williams. He's covered up Epstein. Now he's going to be covering up P. Diddy.
Nick, until recently, as in the past 4 years or so, seems to have gone largely unnoticed, even by mainstream questioners, let's say, like Rogan and Tucker. But Nick has been the champion of bringing to light Franklin scandal, which I believe is the greatest injustice, I think, in American history I've heard. And the reason I think it's nastier than Epstein is because we know more. Maybe I'll change my mind when we get more info, but nasty. If you have any interest in these topics, please check out Nick's books, his podcast, his Twitter. The audible reading of the Franklin scandal by him was great to listen to. This has been Bendy. Have a good night.
I've been in this realm for 20 years now. And what Americans don't understand is that many of our politicians are compromised.